This is the most incredible pastry chef I've ever seen. Not only was his face so dark that you couldn't even make out his features, but he actually managed to get himself crushed to death by his own dessert. And yet Haruto just couldn't accept dying like that. And as if the goddess herself heard his desperate wish, she instantly reincarnated him into another world. In this new life, his family was loving and peaceful, but there wasn't a single ingredient in the entire territory to make any desserts. Then one day, his father Takeshi's subordinate came with both good and bad news. The good news was that, thanks to Haruto's advice, the beans planted in the lime-treated field were growing so well that he was happily waiting for sugar, imagining how, once he finally got some, he could sprinkle it over the roasted beans and make the perfect tea snack, though his lord father, not really understanding, just thought his son was a little crazy. The bad news was that a count had failed to defeat a group of bandits, and their leftovers were now running straight towards their land, at least 50 people, even more than the entire population of their territory. Haruto didn't want all his hard-grown crops to be ruined, but the strength of their land was nowhere near enough to resist them, and he swore to make these people who were blocking his path to sweet-making regret it forever. So he went with his father Takeshi to the capital to participate in the holy ordination ceremony, a ritual that usually could only be done at 13. But since there were bandits attacking and not enough people to defend, Takeshi decided to take a gamble on his own son. When the teleportation magic activated, Haruto was instantly taken to the faraway capital, a place completely different from his rural home, filled with all kinds of dessert-making materials, and just seeing them made his eyes light up, because in his past life he was a world-class pastry chef, though, unfortunately, he died crushed by his own cake in the finals. A way to die so bizarre, it's still hard to believe, but at least he wasn't hit by a truck. Before the ordination ceremony, Takeshi told him that as long as he succeeded, he could buy anything he wanted. Haruto got super excited and immediately picked apples, which surprised Takeshi, because apples usually only grow up north and are very rare here. Even he himself hadn't eaten them many times. But Haruto instantly saw a way to get rich. He wanted to take some apples home and grow them, because if he succeeded, he could make all kinds of amazing desserts. Seeing his son's ambition to contribute to their territory, Takeshi was deeply pleased though. Of course, Haruto's real goal was to build a dessert kingdom. Then, they went to the church, and the priest Fujimoto, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, came out. He was an old friend of Takeshi's, and had last seen them at Haruto's sister Yui's ordination. After some small talk, Fujimoto began the ceremony, which was very special. You had to drink a bowl of incredibly bitter medicine and then be locked up for several hours, because magic is a power that comes from the heart. So to draw it out, you have to face your struggles alone and endure. Normally, most people finish the ceremony in a few hours, but for Haruto, even after an entire day, the magical glow from the device hadn't faded. Takeshi was worried, since for most people this would be pure torture, but in truth, Haruto was just lost in his thoughts, dreaming about all the desserts he could make with apples after this was over. So 2.5 days went by, and he didn't feel a thing. When it finally ended, Haruto received the goddess's blessing, and Takeshi secretly handed Fujimoto a bag of silver coins as hush money, though the priest, not satisfied, decided he'd still spread the word about Haruto anyway. After the ceremony, father and son bought a whole bag of apples and went home. But since the bandits came earlier than expected, Takeshi gathered all the people, told them to destroy abandoned houses, fields, and wells, making sure there'd be nothing for the bandits to use. This plan worked brilliantly. When the bandits arrived, there was nowhere to stay and nothing to eat, so they would definitely try a night attack. To be sure nothing went wrong, Takeshi and his followers went out to scout, and they came back troubled because these bandits were no ordinary thugs. They all looked like knights. There were actually about 70, and 5 of them were really skilled horsemen. To avoid being on the back foot, Takeshi decided to strike first, not to kill, but to cause confusion and weaken them. After a quick raid, they drew a bunch of the bandits away to the west side of the territory. Meanwhile, Haruto was already waiting there. He didn't use magic, but had a group of kids, including his friends Daichi and Sora, ready to throw rocks for an ambush, and it worked perfectly, scattering the bandits' formation. Takeshi seized the chance to attack, holding off the regular soldiers, but the leader Ryuji was tough, charging through the rock barrage and leaping over the barricade, which fired up his men, who all surged forward. The villagers tried to stop them, but they were no match and got dragged down too. Now everyone was mixed up in chaos, but the kids kept hurling rocks, making Ryuji furious enough to rush in with his sword. At this point, you'd expect Haruto to show off some amazing skills, but he just blocked an arrow and was quickly captured by Ryuji. Even then, he didn't panic. He used a new magic he'd learned, which let him copy someone's injuries onto their enemy. Ryuji was shocked. A little kid, and he's a mage? But that was just the start. As long as Haruto had this copy magic, not only could he transfer wounds, but even any magic he'd seen he could mimic and use. Thanks to this special power, he and his friends escaped from Ryuji's clutches, and with his heroics, all the bandits in the territory were captured. Takeshi began handing out rewards. His 2 best friends Daichi and Sora got a sword and a sack of rice each for their bravery, and Haruto was just glad nobody died in the fight, so he could go back to his peaceful life. Ren couldn't wait to show his prize off to his mother, but for her, nothing was more important than having her child safe and sound, and though she worried about without causing trouble for Haruto's family, Haruto made sure his little brother Ren was praised and given the respect he deserved. Both Ren and Rumi performed so well that everyone said they'd surely become important talents for the territory in the future. To celebrate this victory, the Haruto family planned a huge party, and Haruto felt completely satisfied. Now he could finally make desserts in peace. But while everyone was busy, the two little kids, Ren and Rumi, slipped out quietly. They had always been scolded before, and now suddenly being praised by everyone felt strange, almost unreal. Ren was practically floating, and he suddenly wanted to see what was happening to the captured bandits. Since they were determined to be Haruto's future attendants, they felt they had to understand the bandits' situation. The guards at the warehouse refused to let them in, and the two felt annoyed that everyone still treated them like kids. So Ren pulled Rumi to hide in some nearby bushes and, on purpose, threw stones to trick the guard away. The bandit leader, Ryuji, noticed them sneaking in and started talking to Ren, saying that the sword at Ren's waist had once belonged to him, and since he'd be sentenced to death anyway, he wanted to teach Ren its real secret, how it could even be used for magic. Ren, who had always admired Haruto, couldn't resist the temptation. He ignored Rumi's warnings, lifted the weapon, and then the leader lied about needing a spell, tricking Ren into getting close. The ropes binding the leader were already loose, so he kicked Ren away, grabbed the weapon, and wounded Rumi. The guard arrived to see that the leader had already taken Ren hostage. By the time Haruto arrived, Ryuji had already escaped with Ren. Haruto didn't hesitate to chase after the bandit alone, knowing the leader had left traps behind, but with his spirit copy magic, he could imitate anything he'd seen. At this moment, the Spirit Lord, worried after learning what happened, prepared to set out and help, but Tsuritsu argued that, as Lord, he needed to stay and calm the frightened villagers, and chasing after Haruto should be left to someone else. Meanwhile, Ryuji was careless and got knocked off his horse by a trap, and soon Haruto caught up with them. Remembering the sword skills he'd learned from the Spirit Lord, Haruto tried to fight, but Ryuji attacked fiercely and wouldn't let Haruto use any magic, quickly forcing Haruto to retreat. Ren begged Haruto to run and save himself, but Haruto refused. He said, "If you're my subordinate, there's no way I'm leaving you behind." Tsuritsu, following the horse tracks, found only Haruto's broken sword and sadly returned to the territory. But as soon as he walked in, he was shocked to see Haruto and Ren already home, safe and sound. Their mother was so worried that she fell asleep hugging Ren and didn't want to let go. Tsuritsu couldn't believe he'd missed them, but Haruto explained that he'd used spirit copy magic to copy the Spirit Lord's teleportation spell. As long as he'd seen or touched a spell, he could copy it. The Spirit Lord strictly warned Haruto never to tell anyone or use this magic in public. If word got out, people might try to use him as a living weapon, and if he ever teleported into rock or underground, it would be a disaster. They all prayed that the bandit leader would be silenced before he could spill Haruto's secret. Haruto went to visit Rumi, who was recovering, but Ren felt guilty for getting him hurt. Haruto suggested that the best thing was to apologize directly. Rumi's injury was healing well, so Haruto left Ren to make up with him and headed to the kitchen. After all, he preferred making people smile with desserts to fighting. Ren apologized for dragging Rumi into trouble, but Rumi said he'd never blamed him. Suddenly, the sweet smell of apple pie filled the room. Haruto had made dessert for everyone, and the two boys, who'd never tasted sweets before, were instantly hooked. Haruto hoped Ren could use this experience to grow stronger in life. Soon, Rumi's father returned home, and, half joking, said it was Ren's job to marry Rumi off. After all, in this village, men never approach you. Wife? Well, Rumi, how is that good? But Rumi just smiled, and everyone laughed because here, girls reach marriage age at 13. After fighting off the bandits, the Haruto family's land was running out of money, but their parents couldn't ask their old families for help because their marriage had been opposed by both sides. They had run away to start over here. One day, inspired by his future wife's idea, Haruto came up with a great way to make money and excitedly shared it with his parents. Since his 13-year-old sister Yui was of marriageable age and the Lord could use magic, he could often take her out to meet people, a good chance to show off their daughter. But for parents who couldn't use magic, the most effective way was to attend royal banquets in the capital, though traveling that far was dangerous and expensive for normal nobles. Haruto used magic to copy his mother's appearance onto a wooden board, and if people knew he could make these magical portraits, their family's pirates could too. With this, their daughter wouldn't have to travel herself. People could see her likeness from afar. The Lord guessed each magical portrait could sell for at least 5 gold coins, way cheaper than a professional artist and with almost no cost. Tsuritsu worried this might expose Haruto's magic, but Haruto knew they couldn't hide it forever, so it was safer to let outsiders think his magic could only make pictures. Suddenly, Haruto's mother asked him to make a few changes. Later, Haruto and his father visited Count Raitetsu's land. The Count assumed they were here to complain about his failure to defeat the bandits, and since he saw them as mere country nobles, he thought he could just make a few excuses and send them away. He prepared high-quality tea and desserts for Haruto, but when Haruto tasted the sweets, his face went blue, and the tea made him look even more constipated. The Count was confused. Most kids would be thrilled to see such treats, but he admitted the Lord had done a great job managing the territory, and the Lord gave gave all the credit to Haruto. Of course, the Count didn't believe a 10-year-old could be behind such reforms. Trying to change the topic, he asked Haruto about the attack, and Haruto seized the chance to exaggerate, claiming their territory had been raided by hundreds of bandits. The Count realized he might have underestimated them. Haruto went on to reveal they'd learned from the captured bandits that they were from the Count's land, and when the Count tried to play dumb, Haruto said they'd hand the bandits over to the royal capital for investigation. The Count had no choice but to pretend the bandits were survivors from the last raid, but Haruto presented evidence they were the same group, and then the Lord produced items taken from the bandits to prove it. Haruto presented the weapon, and sure enough, it was marked with the Count's family crest. Haruto knew the Count didn't want to make a big deal of things, but even if these were just leftovers from the last attack, they were still bandits from his land, so Haruto insisted on proper compensation. Reluctantly, the Count agreed to pay 100 gold coins, but Haruto pushed until he raised it to 150. The Count finally realized just how capable Haruto was and believed everything the Lord had said. Compared to the risk of letting the bandits go and losing the royal family's trust, paying 150 gold coins was actually a small price. The Count admitted defeat and fully recognized Haruto's abilities. As a parting gift, Haruto used his portrait-mimicking magic to put the Count's face on a silk scarf, making the Count overjoyed. He laughed that this kid really knew how to please women. The so-called genius pastry chef had died without ever achieving his big dreams, only to be reborn in another world and become a matchmaker, all thanks to his awakened ability to copy faces. When the grandson of a duke fell in love at first sight with a girl painted on one of Haruto's canvases, Haruto quickly asked Sukuwari to accept it, saying it was a gift from Count Balak of the frontier and that the girl was none other than the Count's third daughter Petra. Before coming to the banquet, Haruto and his father had visited the Count's land, which was on the border and always involved in little wars with neighboring lands, making it hard for Petra to leave, so she asked Haruto and his father to bring her portrait to the duke. Petra would have her coming-of-age ceremony next month, and the Count hoped Sukuwari would attend as a guest of honor, which he eagerly agreed to without thinking through the details. The duke realized Haruto was a clever schemer and finally stopped underestimating him just because of his age, sighing at his grandson, who now wanted to visit the frontier. Haruto had already figured everything out. With his father's teleportation magic, traveling anywhere was simple. Haruto whispered to the duke that the Count was tired of endless fighting on the border and wanted to use the duke's military power to weaken their neighbor's will to fight, so he hoped for a marriage alliance. The duke understood immediately and announced loudly that he would visit the Count's land together, wanting the king to hear about this and wait for the kingdom's decision before taking the next step. Sukuwari asked Haruto what Petra liked, and Haruto, who'd only met her once, just knew she loved desserts, so he'd given his own sweets as a gift. Sukuwari, though, wanted something else. He wanted Haruto to make as many portraits of Petra as possible, and the more charming, the better. Haruto brought home letters from the Count and the Duke for his father, full of good news. For helping defeat the bandits, they'd receive 20,000 silver coins as a reward, and the engagement between the Duke's grandson and the Count's daughter would be publicly announced after their coming of age. To get the perfect portrait, Haruto worked non-stop for 2.5 days until the Count was satisfied, paying an extra 30 gold coins as a deposit for guarding Petra. When she traveled to the capital for her ceremony, there'd be plenty of danger. Some groups didn't want the two houses to unite, and the church, which was supposed to be neutral, couldn't be trusted to keep secrets unless paid a lot. If they only had to protect Petra, the Spirit Lord could just teleport her, but with her servants and friends, they needed many more guards, especially for the journey, and once in the capital. The Count only trusted the Spirit Lord with this task, and if they succeeded, Haruto's family would have the favor of two of the most powerful nobles, an essential step for his future desert kingdom. Haruto thought the best place to protect Petra was the little dark room used for the church's blessing ritual, so on the day they left, he rode in a carriage with his twin siblings, though his sister looked bored, just coming along for the ride. Haruto's plan was to use the blessing ritual as an excuse to hide out in the church, staying in the little dark room until the ceremony, so only one entrance needed to be guarded. The moment they left, the Count got news that someone was plotting to hurt Petra. After the carriage reached the church, the coachman ran away, and attackers came out of the woods, keeping the Spirit Lord and the Count busy while a third rushed straight for the carriage. Haruto drew his sword and bravely defended the ladies, leaving a deep impression on his sister. Just as a fourth enemy appeared and things looked grim, a flash of steel knocked away the attacker's weapon. Haruto and his father fought together and beat back the threat. The girls were still trembling from the danger as everyone hurried down the stairs. Haruto's sister, scared, reached out and he comforted her, promising to always protect her. Right then, an invisible red string seemed to tie the two even closer. Even when kidnapped, Haruto couldn't help matchmaking with noble ladies. The enemies wanted to kidnap Petra, hoping to embarrass the Duke's family or play hero and use that fame to climb back to noble status. Their leader knew it was all about making the Duke lose face. If his grandson's fiancée was snatched, it'd be a huge disgrace, and he hoped to turn the rescue into his own claim to glory. Petra felt as long as she could meet her fiancé, everything would be fine, and when she saw his portrait, she blushed at how handsome he looked. Haruto, enjoying his role as matchmaker, watched Petra get taken away by the Duke's people after her blessing. The Lord gave Haruto an important mission. Until Petra returned with her engagement finalized, Haruto had to stay with his sister Licorisu and be her bodyguard, his big chance to play the protector. He suggested to Licorisu that they rest in the lounge, but felt awkward since her maid wouldn't let anyone near her, always on guard even if Haruto was just a kid. Suddenly, Haruto heard a strange sound and the ground shook. A massive pit opened beneath him and Licorisu, and as the Lord rushed in, both kids had already vanished. They had vanished without a trace, and there was no doubt that only magic could make something like this happen in an instant. The Lord, anxious for their safety, jumped straight into the pit after them. But no matter how far he searched, he only ended up in a nearby building with not a single sign of life. When Haruto finally regained consciousness, he realized he'd lost his freedom, and though he asked his captors to explain the situation, they refused to give him any answers. Haruto was baffled why anyone would kidnap him. After all, he was just the son of a poor knight. But soon, he realized the real target might be Licorisu, and he swore to himself that he would protect her no matter what. Before leaving, the boss threatened Haruto, saying that any strange moves would mean instant death. When Licorisu woke up, confused and scared, Haruto quickly explained what was happening and promised to keep her safe. For some reason, just hearing him say that made Licorisu feel much calmer, while the little henchman nearby rolled his eyes, complaining that Haruto was still flirting at a time like this. Since they didn't know what was happening outside, Haruto didn't dare act rashly and tried his best to gather information first. Joking about ransom, he realized if something happened to him, his family could lose 200 gold coins in an instant, and if the kidnappers were nobles, the price would be even higher, because disputes between nobles always ended in gold. The henchman's reaction convinced Haruto that the mastermind was definitely a noble, and from the old, once glorious decor, he guessed this was the mansion of a fallen duke. Haruto's family had already listed out all the nobles with grudges against the duke and count, and the most likely suspect was the former Duke Amanya. Haruto secretly untied the ribbon behind his back, copied a message onto it, and used his mimic magic to send it to his father. When the Lord received the message, he immediately sent Tsuritsu to Duke Amanya's old mansion, and she rushed out to call for help. Soon the boss returned to the house, furious and yelling at Licorisu. She'd lost her mind, because the person in front of her was her own sister, which meant she'd never get paid. Right now, the elder sister was attending the engagement party at the Duke's house, and since the plan was already ruined, the boss decided to kill them both to cover her tracks. At that moment, Haruto drew his sword and slashed the boss's hand, while her henchman had already been knocked to the ground. It was chaos. Haruto, supposed to be Petra's bodyguard, ended up acting more like a fiancé. As the fight raged, sounds of rescue came from outside, and before long, Haruto's father and his men burst in. The room that was chosen for its security had become a trap for the boss, but she used magic to open a hole in the floor and escaped, with Haruto's father warning not to chase desperate criminals. Soon, except for the boss, all the culprits, including men from the Amanya family, were caught. The Lord warned Haruto about the Amanya family and asked him to go explain the situation, but the Lord left the actual report to his men since only his own magic could track the fugitive. Returning to the old mansion, Haruto recalled how little magic he'd felt in the underground room, so the boss couldn't have gone far. When no one saw anyone suspicious, he guessed she was hiding nearby, and sure enough, they soon caught her trying to slip away. Haruto insisted on facing her himself, and as their swords clashed, she underestimated him as just a kid. But the instant their blades met, her sword snapped in two. Haruto had secretly copied the crack in the wall onto her blade. He struck her down with the flat of his sword, but felt no happiness. He just wanted to go back to building his dessert kingdom. A month later, the Duke's grandson and the Count's daughter held their wedding, and the Duke thanked Haruto and his father for their help. Haruto brought up a detail from the kidnapping. The criminals were so meticulous, yet made such a basic mistake in taking the wrong hostage. He guessed the culprit got bad intel, and for a fallen noble like Amanya to have several hideouts in the capital, there had to be a third party pulling the strings. The real winner from all this would surely be the one behind it all. The person Amanya hated most was whoever replaced them after their fall, and the Duke realized Haruto was hinting at him. If Haruto hadn't been involved, his whole family could have been doomed. The Duke was annoyed, feeling like a watchdog who'd bitten its master, but Haruto used the incident to push for more support for his family's land, threatening to take his story to the Count otherwise. The Duke agreed to help, but insisted the whole plot really was his idea, and the kidnapping was just an accident, even though Licorisu had been put in real danger. Afterwards, the Count also visited Haruto's family, saying he recognized Haruto's great potential and wanted to betroth Licorisu to him. Licorisu agreed, but Haruto was left stunned. He didn't feel worthy, which only made the Count upset, thinking Haruto was rejecting his daughter. Haruto quickly denied it, and the engagement was settled. The Lord didn't dare object, and Haruto was left feeling like it was all a dream. Somehow, he'd ended up with a fiancé. Licorisu later found Haruto, admitting she was unsure he would really want her, but when Haruto said he was happy, her heart was finally at peace. Haruto's life now had a new goal: to protect her smile at any cost. One noblewoman was so impressed with the 9 9-year-old Haruto that she even spilled her tea. She lamented not having a daughter herself, or Haruto would be her own son-in-law. And if only she were younger, or Haruto older, she would have tried for him herself. When the Lord came home and apologized to his wife for adding another girl to the family, she felt like her world was ending, thinking her husband had cheated. She demanded to know all about the new girl, and only then, the lady of the house quickly realized the Lord was talking about Haruto's fiancé. And after seeing his wife slip away quietly, the Lord assumed she might not be able to accept it. But in reality, she was eager to meet her future daughter-in-law. Haruto soon received a special gift from the Duke, a sapling of the black locust tree, which could grow even in barren soil and attract bees, making it an important ingredient for desserts. Since the territory didn't get much rain, Haruto decided to build some reservoirs, and soon Saritsu brought the Lord bad news. Haruto had started a new experiment and taken some friends out of the village. Haruto went to a rocky cliff where he used his glowing fist to punch the rock and create an explosion. When the smoke cleared, there was a huge hole. He'd copied the earth-digging magic from the kidnappers and now, totally thrilled, quickly dug a giant square reservoir. Once filled with water and surrounded by black locusts, the effect would be doubled. Haruto was lost in his happy daydreams, not realizing his father was glaring at him. The booming noise had made him think the mountain was collapsing. In just a month, Haruto had carved out 3 reservoirs and even built water channels, solving the water supply problem for the whole territory. Suddenly, his sister Yui brought a letter, teasing that it must be from his cute fiancé, so she delivered it personally. Haruto shyly took the letter, only to be shocked by its contents. It was actually an invitation from the wealthy countess, inviting him to a new tea-tasting event. Haruto was suspicious and wondered if it was a trick, but the Lord had just returned from the capital with big news. He had brought Haruto's fiancé, Licorisu, back with him, and for some reason, she would be staying for a while. Seeing Haruto so serious, Licorisu couldn't help but see him in the best light. This time, Haruto was making golden candy, and the designs were so beautiful that Licorisu almost couldn't bear to eat them. Outside the door, 3 women were peeking in and watching the scene unfold. Then Haruto made candied apples, wrapping cooked syrup around the fruit, and Licorisu praised them with every bite. Haruto then opened the door and caught the peepers, making the mother and daughter run away embarrassed, leaving their little sidekick behind to face Haruto. Afterwards, Haruto and Licorisu went to the countess's tea party, where Haruto admired even the crystal chandelier, thinking about how many barrels of sugar it could buy. The countess's assistant introduced Haruto to everyone, and he took the chance to promote his golden candy. All the nobles present were filled with happiness, and the candy paired perfectly with the countess's tea. Haruto mentioned he'd made plenty more, and that the nobles could ask their merchant partners to bring some as gifts, but requested that sugar products not be taxed so heavily. Since processed sugar wasn't produced in high quantities, high taxes made things hard for merchants. The countess, carrying 2 large lamps, appeared and took a strong interest in Haruto's proposal, while Licorisu felt the pressure of her presence. The countess wanted to talk privately with Haruto, and Licorisu, worried, grabbed his sleeve, but Haruto assured her he'd be fine and asked the maids to take care of her. Inside, the room was tightly guarded, and Haruto thought they were afraid he'd cause trouble, but the countess said if that were the case, they'd need 10 times the guards, since magic could make most protection useless. After tasting Haruto's golden candy, the countess was full of praise. Haruto promised that in less than 3 years, his territory could produce large quantities of sugar and honey, and though the countess was surprised, she believed this clever boy might just pull it off, so she agreed to let him use her port for shipping, though she made it clear she planned to swallow up his whole vision in the future. Her assistant let slip that many eligible women at the party had feelings for Haruto, and gossip about him filled the air. Licorisu was uncomfortable with this atmosphere and wanted to go home. Meanwhile, Haruto finished his business with the countess and worried about Licorisu. The countess teased that her family would be thrilled about the marriage, and Haruto, blushing, insisted no one could refuse a marriage with Licorisu since he was so adorable. The countess joked about how deep and sly Haruto was, though he insisted he wasn't blushing. But then she suddenly hugged him, and just as Haruto, overwhelmed, hoped she was joking, Licorisu came in and saw it all. The countess gave Licorisu a challenging look, and while she was a kind person, she had just given Haruto an intense mental workout in front of his fiancé. Licorisu ran off, and the countess found it amusing. Haruto tried to explain it was just because she saw him as a kid, but Licorisu wasn't upset about the mind reading. He was bothered by all the women talking about Haruto, and it made him worry about the future. He envied his sister Petra, who was always so social and well-liked while he was quiet and withdrawn. Haruto reassured him, saying he didn't need to change or become another Petra, that he liked Licorisu just as he was and would always love him more and more. He asked Licorisu to wait for him, then teleported away and returned with a special apple candy, the only one in the world made just for him. Licorisu took a bite, and the sweet flavor filled his mouth, bringing back the happiness of their first shared treat, a taste meant only for them. Haruto explained that many places made apple candy, sometimes sometimes called love apples, and that he had put all his feelings into this one. Seeing Licorisu touched Haruto gently asked Licorisu if he was willing to trust him, saying, "I want you to be happy. I always want to see your smile." Hearing this, Licorisu smiled with relief, and Haruto felt so grateful. He'd nearly lost that beautiful smile. His dream was to build a country where everyone could enjoy sweets and be happy, but that world had to include Licorisu, just as every region needs its own land. The two were lost in a deep, emotional moment, but were suddenly interrupted by a clueless maid calling, "Miss, I'm here to pick you up," over and over, totally ruining the mood. The maid teased, telling the little sister to remember that Haruto searched far and wide for goat's milk just to make her a dessert, and even brought it from distant lands. He thanked her, but said it was actually for Licorisu. Ever since learning that his future father-in-law was about to go to war with the neighboring country, both Haruto and Licorisu couldn't understand why people had to fight. Wouldn't it be nicer to just make sweets and enjoy them together? Haruto thought if everyone could smile and eat desserts like he did, the whole world would be happier. That day, a merchant was supposed to bring goats for making cheesecake for Licorisu, but the goats were stolen on the way by another noble, a sneaky baron famous for bullying the weak and fearing the strong. Since Haruto and Licorisu hadn't officially announced their engagement, it was hard to ask the Count for help. They hadn't expected the war news to affect their land so quickly. Haruto was furious. He didn't care about titles. Anyone who stood in the way of his dessert making had to be dealt with. If they let things slide, their land would be looked down on, so he insisted on negotiating with the baron himself. The lord told him to calm down, since collecting food during wartime was normal, and the baron's land was closer to the battlefield. Plus, he had paid for the goats. Even if they asked, he'd just refuse on the grounds of war. Haruto was upset, not wanting to disappoint Licorisu. There was only one way to get the supplies first. If they joined the battle as reinforcements, they'd get priority in getting resources. Since the Count was Haruto's future father-in-law, they had a good reason to help. Meanwhile, the Duke's grandson stared at Petra's photo, making her angry because she was right there and he was more interested in her picture. He said she was so cute, he had to get used to looking at her by looking at photos. The Count got word that the enemy only had around 10,000 troops, and with their own strength they could handle it, but he needed the Duke's grandson at the front to show support. The enemy's plan was to split the Count from the Duke, and though the Duke's grandson had no real battle experience, the Count thought he could give him an easy victory. If they won, they'd owe the Count a favor, but if things went wrong, the Count would be isolated and vulnerable. When Haruto arrived, the Duke's grandson had already set out. The Lord, an experienced warrior, saw the enemy troops' formation on the map and found it odd. They were set up as if defending, not invading. If he was leading, he'd keep most troops at base and send only a few to harass the enemy and slowly wear them down. For example, at the fork in the road the Duke's grandson was approaching. As expected, his unit was ambushed and trapped. They ran into the forest, but the enemy had already prepared an ambush. The men wanted to surrender, but the Duke's grandson, determined to fight for Petra, pushed forward. At the critical moment, a sudden arrow struck the enemy, and Haruto and his father arrived just in time to save them. The Duke's grandson survived his first battle, but felt no happiness, not even when his cute fiancée came to check on him. He knew that without Haruto, his father, and his loyal soldiers, he'd be dead. The Lord explained that all rookies get hurt in their first battle, but as future heir, he had to face these trials. Petra felt bad for her fiancé, but didn't know how to comfort him. The Lord left it to Haruto, since he'd encouraged Ren before. Even Petra didn't know what her fiancé liked. She just wanted him to smile again. Haruto got inspired and asked the adults to help gather ingredients. The Count threw a celebration feast, and Haruto hurried to make a dessert. At the party, the soldiers grumbled that Haruto and his father had stolen all the credit, and the Duke's grandson felt bitter. He was only promoted because of his status, but still felt like he'd let everyone down. The Count had prepared this moment for him, but he'd messed it up. When Haruto finished and opened the lid, the fragrance filled the hall. It was a dessert the world had never seen, and for a moment, even the Duke's grandson forgot his troubles. Haruto explained that the dessert was born from a failed attempt, but that if you never let a failed experience end in failure, it's never wasted. What matters is to keep moving forward and trying again. He'd always been taught never to fail, but Petra told him he hadn't failed. He'd kept his promise and come back alive to see her again. Still, the Duke's grandson felt guilty over the men lost in battle, and even in victory, he couldn't celebrate. His loyal soldiers made Petra proud to be his fiancé, and the fact that he returned alive was her greatest joy. The Duke's grandson, cheered up by Petra's encouragement, found his spirit restored, and the two adults looked on with satisfaction, knowing from experience that the pain of the battlefield could only be overcome by oneself. As thanks, the Count told Haruto he could ask for anything he wanted, so Haruto brought back loads of goods to the territory, along with a letter from his future father-in-law for Licorisu. Then it was time to get revenge for the Baron stealing their goats, and that was why the Lord hadn't returned with them. He wanted to teach the Baron a lesson too. Tsuritsu could only sigh at how much Haruto and his father thought alike, but since the Baron started all the trouble, even if they bought out his whole family's livestock now, he had no right to complain, especially after their recent victory. The Lord wanted to make the Baron feel twice the pain he'd caused, but suddenly Suddenly, he teleported home, asking Haruto to help him use the teleportation magic to move supplies. It turned out the Lord had rushed ahead of the Baron and bought the 2 best horses that were supposed to go to him. These horses had been raised at great cost by the Baron, so this move would surely make him regret ever crossing them.